The COVID-19 pandemic had a massive and lasting impact on education. But exactly how do we define that impact, and what are some steps we can take to help us begin recovery from that? That's what I wanted to explore as part of my EDT 657 Masters Practicum work, and I want to share the results of that data with you today. We're going to look at defining learning loss from the COVID-19 pandemic and whether project-based learning is a potential solution to help us in our recovery. We're going to also look at some potential solutions that already have begun in the state of Maine and what recommendations I have for helping us move forward. As we examine the research that looks at project-based learning's role in learning loss recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, I want to specifically look at 6 different pieces. We're going to first introduce the problem that I was examining as part of this research. I realized pretty quickly I needed to actually quantify learning loss from the pandemic. I wanted to also define project-based learning because there's lots of different facets and types of project-based learning. Then we're going to look at the benefits and barriers for teachers for project-based learning. And finally, we're going to look at some current and proposed solutions that already exist within Maine and recommendations I have moving forward. So as the introduction to the problem, what I really wanted to examine was, does project-based learning have a role in learning loss recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic? But while there were multiple pieces of it, the one that I felt like I really needed to start with is quantifying learning loss specifically. What do we define it as? What amounts are we looking at? What specific topics and areas does learning loss seem to be focused? And in the process of defining learning loss, I realized that we had to kind of look at the pandemic in 2 different stages because the data was really multifaceted in one of the 2 stages, but really consistent in the other. The stage where the data was consistent was early pandemic, which I'm going to define as March 2020 to August 2020. That was really the end of the 2019-2020 school year, and 94% of students were affected worldwide, and most schools, especially in the United States, were fully closed during that time. Now, the mid to late pandemic were the next 2 school years, because during those school years, each state had vastly different precaution methods. Schools within states had vastly different precaution methods. When COVID would hit a community, that would change precautions, school closures, and all of those different components. So we're going to look at the data of these 2 pieces separate. Now, we'll also focus the vast majority of our research on the United States, and that's mainly just to maintain scope of this project at a reasonable fashion for me to complete it within this semester. So as we examine the 2 stages of the pandemic, like I talked about before, early pandemic results were really consistent, and that's because the schools had a really consistent response to the pandemic. During this time, we saw unprecedented drops in mathematics scores, about a 3-month learning loss, and steep drops in reading, which about a month and a half. These results are not unsurprising because many schools, including my own, really moved away from any instruction or assessment during this time in the name of equity. Many students didn't have any internet access, so they had no means of communicating with teachers. If those students were at home and did barely any learning during that end of the school year, it would make sense that the learning loss would be about the length of the remaining amount of that school year. There also begins the trend here of mathematics data being less steep or being steeper in learning loss information than reading data. Now, the mid to late pandemic is where the inconsistent responses created inconsistent data. For the sake of this research, I examined 3 standardized testing points because they gave me the clearest data to draw from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. So I looked at the Renaissance STAR data, the NWEA or NWEA data, and then the NAEP, which is the national test. The NAEP data especially allows us to draw a very clear line of comparison from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic because the test has been given for so many years in such a consistent fashion. Because I looked at these 3 areas most specifically, we're going to focus on reading and math data because that's the one we saw the most. And the short version is that the average predictors, even the most optimistic of those average predictors, show a substantial amount of time of recovery. Data is going to continue to come out as we begin to examine learning loss solutions, but I wanted to make sure we start at a place to understand that recovery is going to take years. And while there are people who want to draw a direct line of correlation from specific pandemic responses to specific amounts of learning loss, the data doesn't show us that right now. And while the NAEP data showed historic drops across the board, clear correlations between the amount of in-person schooling and the amount of learning loss are really hard to draw right now. While we do look at fourth grade math data does show historic drops, every single state listed here had a decrease for the first time in NAEP data. The amount of in-person schooling does appear to show a positive correlation with decreasing learning loss. But when we look at fourth grade reading by comparison, that direct correlation becomes less clear. If we examine eighth grade data, the correlations start to even become a negative trend of the amount of in-person schooling and the amount of learning loss. All of this is to say that anyone who is trying to draw a direct correlation between the in-person percent in a state and the amount of learning loss is either misreading the data or they are purposefully misrepresenting specific points of data to try to send a message. For example, if we look at Los Angeles as a city, and California is one of the examples of states that had very severe COVID precautions in terms of amount of remote schooling required. Los Angeles showed a 9-point increase in eighth grade reading, while national scores fell by 3 points, and California as a state fell by 0. To make that a clearer point, if Los Angeles City was its own state, it would have had the highest increase in eighth grade reading of any place in the United States, while having some of the most severe COVID precautions. But that doesn't mean there aren't clear trends in the data that can help inform us moving forward. I saw 3 consistent themes while looking through the standardized testing data. Throughout the course of my research, 3 things repeatedly showed up. The first was that the data shows worrying signs across the board. All subjects, all states, and all grades seem to be struggling with learning losses related to the COVID-19 pandemic. No one is immune. Reading does show slight improvements over math, and lower grades show slightly less loss than older grades. And the working theory right now is simply that reading is easier to teach at home during math when many parents had to take up that mantle, and lower grade content is easier to teach than upper grade content, which would also fit within what the data is showing us. And finally, the part that I feel like is being missed in a lot of research right now is that historically marginalized groups show even larger statistical gaps than before. If there is a group that had a gap of learning compared to a standard group of students, that gap is even larger now. Which brought me to, is project-based learning actually a potential solution to those 3 problems? When defining project-based learning, I looked at Mason and Marshall's research on how they looked at 8 specific elements, which are listed here. Now, I didn't feel like every single project-based learning application had to apply all 8 of these elements, but these were the pieces that I looked for specifically when defining whether something was project-based learning for the sake of this work or not. And when I looked at project-based learning benefits, this is also where the research that I had done at the beginning started to be hard to define. Because we all understand that the COVID-19 pandemic had massive impacts beyond just learning loss. My interviews showed social and emotional deficits that were larger than ever that don't show up on standardized testing data. The benefits of project-based learning in many cases aligned with some of those problems. So I sought to research growth from students who partook in project-based learning in these specific areas. Soft skills, 21st century skills, feelings of self and efficacy,
a better growth mindset, and then finally at the end, I wanted to examine the impacts on standardized testing data itself. And from my results, I found some pretty clear trends. There were some strong improvements in capturing deep, meaningful learning for students rather than surface level understanding. There were increased emotional, behavioral, and cognitive engagement scores for students. Project-based learning students were more intrinsically motivated, had higher critical thinking, and had a greater appreciation of peer learning. And finally, they had increased school enjoyment, collaboration skills, and overall non-cognitive data. All of these pieces matched up with the interviews of teachers in the field that had identified non-learning loss specific problems within their students.
And while quite a bit of data showed a positive relationship between project based learning and increasing standardized testing scores, it wasn't consistent enough across all forms of data for me to define it as correlational for this research. However, one thing that was clear is that not a single part of the data research that I did showed project based learning having a negative impact on standardized testing data, which would argue that we could get all of the positive soft skill benefits that we talked about earlier while looking at no negative impact on standardized testing data.
That result brought me to the question of, if the data is so clear about the benefits of project based learning, why doesn't everybody already do this learning strategy consistently? I identified 6 different barriers for teachers and schools about why they're not implementing more project based learning. So the first one is learning loss impacts, what we talked about before. There's a culture around learning loss and making sure that we're creating strategies that directly correlate to it. And while I don't necessarily agree with this as a solution, it does appear to be more rigid and standardized curriculums in response to that learning loss. Inflexible curriculums was something that was brought up in every single interview that I did as part of this research. The teachers that I interviewed were self selective because they were doing innovative types of teaching strategies pre pandemic. And every single one had mentioned a push from whether within or near their school building to reduce the innovation in their classroom and return to a more standardized curriculum. Now, project based learning does require a huge amount of resources and it's expensive. That's something that was true before the pandemic and will definitely be true after it. But also, curriculum costs is something that we have to keep in mind. If we are changing our curriculum in response to the learning loss from the pandemic, that costs money in and of itself. If you bought an expensive new textbook series, then asking for resources that match project based learning is something that's going to be very difficult to do. Now, lack of adequate training is something that I feel like we have the potential to solve, but it is incredibly important now to consider, especially with the high rates of turnover that we're seeing in education. And finally, lack of institutional support, which kind of connects all of these pieces together. If you are teaching in an innovative way that is outside of the norm, not having support from within your building or community is going to make you less likely to continue teaching in that fashion. So, is this a solvable problem? What steps is Maine as a state already taking, and what recommendations do I have for us moving forward? So, in the process of looking at solutions, I split these barriers into 3 categories, which the first category being learning loss impacts leading to more inflexible curriculums. I feel like the 2 solutions that Maine is already taking that are moving in the right direction are the change to an interdisciplinary instruction team at the Maine Department of Education. Instead of having specific content learning specialists, they now have interdisciplinary instruction specialists that are designed to look at this project based, whole class, cross curricular approach in order to try to holistically look at solving some of these problems. Along with Moose, which was created as a pandemic response, which is free curriculum for any teacher in Maine to use that is created by teachers in Maine. Teachers can apply to be distinguished educators to create content for Moose modules. So we know the content is created by specialists who are highly certified. But Moose, in and of itself, becomes professional development. It creates a professional learning community that is beneficial for the teachers who both create the content and the teachers who use it. I would like to see two changes that can continue to improve this process. The first one is creating regional cohorts for teachers to build content. I think Moose is a fantastic idea, and increasing that mindset to smaller regions instead of simply statewide, I think is a fantastic idea. The other change is that the interdisciplinary team doesn't have any content specialist, and I think it would be possible to have both things at the same time. Because right now it feels like, to an outside perspective, that in order to do interdisciplinary content, you have to do all content areas simultaneously. Where I think it would be extremely valuable to help a skeptical teacher implement math and science projects together, or ELA and social studies projects together, or maybe music and social studies and math together into a project. I think progress is more important than hitting a perfect goal.
I also would like to see a much clearer line drawn between these strategies and learning loss recovery. I think Maine is at the forefront for creating innovative strategies within this mindset, but I feel like there's not a clear distinction being made that these strategies are effective as a means to directly combat this problem.
Looking at the barriers of lack of resources and overall curriculum costs, I feel like Maine has taken some really impressive steps forward. Recently, the DOE has provided free mobile computer science labs for all Maine public schools. These labs are worth up to $5,000 of equipment, and schools could choose which of the labs they were using per 100 students in their building. There's also programs like the REV program or the Maine Outdoor Learning Initiative that are taking steps forward for providing authentic project based learning for schools in Maine. These are all fantastic programs, and I would like to see them continued and expanded forward as we make progress towards combating learning loss. And finally, when we think about lack of adequate training and overall lack of institutional support, I feel like we can take the solutions that already exist and continue to expand upon them to make a unified solution. For example, the mobile labs that we just talked about that are $5,000 worth of equipment, there is now a training program supported where every school can send one person to get this professional development and then return that professional development back to their school. I would like to see the department raise and focus on this training as it starts in January of next year and continues for a calendar year to put highlights on the success of this program. Recently, Moose module training has been brought up by the interdisciplinary instruction team at the Maine department as well, which interconnects those two programs forward to make sure there is a clear distinction between project based learning as a solution to learning loss. I would like to see this type of training expanded to more regional events to support innovative teaching. Like I talked about before, instead of interdisciplinary instruction having to use all content areas simultaneously, I think it would be important to showcase examples of interdisciplinary content with 2 or 3 content areas. Showcase examples of teachers doing effective project-based learning strategies with something like Maine Sharing the Success campaign, making sure to put a spotlight on those teachers so that they feel that institutional support both within their community but also from a state level.
And while this semester is ending and this project is over, I'm excited to see the results of more learning loss data that comes out throughout the year to see if we're making any progress towards the recovery of this process. I'm also excited to see project-based learning's role in that recovery and whether Maine continues to support the programs that I think are moving us in the right direction.
And while I believe this research was a great place to start, by no means do I feel like this conversation is over. There will continue to be more research, more solutions, and more data, and I'm excited about continuing the conversation. If you wanted to contact me, you could either look at my main.edu email or my Twitter account, and I would love to continue the conversation with you if you had any questions. This slide deck will also be available in the description below.